My name is Ella Watson. I'm 32 years old, and on a Saturday night in March, in a lakeside mansion on the western shore of Lake Austin with 67 people watching, I stood on a small stage and pressed play on an audio file that ended an engagement, a career, and the version of my family that had existed for 30 years. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened that night, because the easy version, the revenge version, the satisfying montage version, leaves out the part that actually matters. It leaves out the 7 years I spent being invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to see me. It leaves out the 18 months I built something in silence, in the dark, on a kitchen table in a one-bedroom apartment in East Austin, while my family told anyone who would listen that I was the one who hadn't quite figured it out yet, claiming I was nothing more than my brother's employee. So let me start at the end, the way these stories deserve to be told, and then I'll take you all the way back to the beginning. I'm standing on that stage, behind me a projection screen that was supposed to show a slideshow of Dylan and Anne, their vacation photos, their proposal moment, their curated story of two people in love. The room smells like eucalyptus centerpieces and expensive wine. My mother is at the head table in a pale pink dress she bought specifically for this night. My father is next to her, the practiced smile of a man who has spent his entire life performing success for an audience. And Dylan, my younger brother, 28 years old, senior manager at Callaway Tech, my direct supervisor for the last 3 years, is standing 4 feet to my left, holding a champagne flute, the smile on his face slowly changing shape into something I don't have a word for. The audio starts playing, and the room goes completely still. If you've ever been introduced by your own family as an extension of someone else, if you've been the background character in a story that was supposed to be yours too, type background character in the comments, because that night, I was done being the backdrop. To understand that night on the lake, you need to understand what it meant to grow up a Watson in Cedar Park, Texas. Cedar Park is a suburb north of Austin, the kind of place where the neighborhoods have entrance gates and the Little League fields have corporate sponsors, and every block has at least one family who has made it, visibly and loudly and with the right vehicle in the driveway. My father, Tony Watson, 58 years old, owned 3 used car dealerships across the Austin metro, one in Cedar Park, one in Round Rock, and one in Pflugerville. They were profitable, steady businesses. Not glamorous, but enough, more than enough, for Tony Watson to have opinions about what success was supposed to look like and who in his family was achieving it. My mother, Rose Watson, was 55. She'd never worked outside the home after Dylan was born, which she described as a choice, and which she had spent the subsequent 28 years defending through the management of appearances. The family's social media, the Christmas cards, the updates she gave at church to the women in her circle, delivered with the precision of someone filing a quarterly report. Rose knew exactly what the Watson family's brand was. She'd built it herself, and Dylan was the centerpiece of everything she'd constructed. Dylan was born in September of 1996, 4 years after me, and I think the specific way my parents looked at him, with that particular mixture of pride and relief, was something they never fully examined and never fully hid. He was the easier child, they sometimes said, as if ease were a virtue rather than a description of how little he'd ever been required to work for their approval. He was charming in the way that youngest children sometimes are, quick with a joke, quick with a smile, quick to understand that the room responded to him and to adjust himself accordingly. These are good qualities. I want to be fair about that. Dylan was not a bad person. He was a person who had never once been handed a reason to look closely at himself, and that has consequences whether you intend them or not. I kept a mental list, the way you keep receipts, not because I planned to use it, just because I needed somewhere to put the evidence of what was happening. When Dylan made the JV baseball team at Cedar Park High School in 2011, my father bought him a new glove, a Rawlings Pro Preferred, $279, wrapped in tissue paper and a box on the kitchen table when Dylan came home from tryouts. When I made the academic decathlon team that same year, my father said, "Good job, kiddo," and went back to his laptop. When Dylan graduated from Texas A&M in May of 2019 with his MBA, my parents threw a party for 61 people, tent rental in the backyard, a caterer from Round Rock, a playlist Dylan had curated himself. My father gave a speech that lasted 9 minutes and ended with him pulling Dylan into a hug that I can still see exactly when I close my eyes. When I graduated from UT Austin in May of 2016 with my bachelor's in computer science, we went to a restaurant in the Domain, just the four of us, and my father spent the last 20 minutes of the meal taking a call outside he said couldn't wait. I don't tell you this to make you angry on my behalf, though I understand if you are. I tell you because these things accumulated the way sediment accumulates, quietly, steadily, over years, until one day you look down and realize the ground beneath you is a different substance than it was when you started. And then there was Ann Caldwell, 29 years old, MBA from Wharton, Director of Operations at Callaway Tech. She and Dylan had met at a company event in the spring of 2022, been inseparable by summer, and by December of that year, she was at every Watson family dinner, sitting next to my mother, receiving the exact kind of warm, unconditional welcome I had spent my entire childhood trying to earn through performance. My mother loved Anne immediately and completely, the way she loved things that confirmed what she already believed about the world. Anne was polished. Anne had a Wharton MBA. Anne wore the right shoes and laughed at my father's jokes and told Rose that the house looked beautiful in a way that was specific enough to sound genuine. Within 6 months, my mother was describing Anne to her church friends as the daughter she always wished she had. I was standing right there when she said it. She didn't mean it as an insult. I think that was almost the harder part. Looking back, I can see exactly when I stopped waiting for them to say the right thing. I just hadn't yet decided what I was going to do instead. I joined Callaway Tech in March of 2017. I was 25 years old with a bachelor's in computer science from UT Austin, 18 months of contract UX work behind me, and the specific hunger of someone who has something to prove and no idea yet how costly the proving will be. Callaway Tech was a B2B software company, workflow automation tools for mid-sized businesses, the kind of product that nobody talks about at parties, but that keeps entire companies running. I was hired as an associate UX designer. My starting salary was $54,000. Within 18 months, I'd been promoted to senior UX designer at $78,000. By year 4, my performance reviews were consistent, exceeds expectations in every category. I was the person the engineers came to before a client presentation. I was the person project managers looped in when a product wasn't landing. I was the person that clients asked for by name. I did not have the title that matched any of that. I did not have the compensation that matched it either. What I had was Dylan, arriving in January of 2022 with a title that superseded mine, a confidence I recognized as belonging to someone who had been told yes his entire life, and an immediate instinct, not malicious, I think, just reflexive, to establish the distance between us. At the first team meeting after he joined, he introduced me to a new stakeholder as his sister, who'd been with the team for a while. Not Ella Watson, senior UX designer, not the person who built the client onboarding framework you've been using for 2 years, just his sister, a supporting detail, a warm body with a familiar last name. I smiled. I shook the stakeholder's hand. After the meeting, I went to my car in the parking garage, sat in the driver's seat for 11 minutes, and then drove to a coffee shop on East 6th Street and opened my laptop. The dynamic shifted in other ways, too, over the months that followed. Small things, at first, the kind of things that are easy to explain away if you want to explain them away badly enough. A project I've been leading for 8 months quietly transferred to a newer team member without a conversation. A commendation I'd received in a client email, specific, detailed, praising the UX work on a migration that had taken me 6 weeks, appeared in the quarterly report attributed to the team rather than to anyone in particular. I mentioned it once, carefully, to Dylan in a one-on-one. He said it was better not to single people out publicly, that it created friction on the team. I said I understood. I went back to my desk and I kept that receipt. In November of 2022, there was a product review with a client from Dallas, a company called Harmon Logistics, our third largest account at the time. I had built their entire onboarding flow from the ground up over the previous year, and the relationship manager had specifically requested that I present the Q4 updates. 2 days before the meeting, Dylan told me he'd be leading the presentation instead, that he wanted to be more visible with the major accounts. He said he'd make sure to credit the team. He didn't mention my name once during the 40-minute presentation. I sat at the end of the conference table and answered technical questions when the client asked them directly, and Dylan would say things like, "That's one of the things our team has really developed well," and "Look at his slides." And I would answer, and the client would nod and thank me by name, and Dylan would move to the next slide. I kept that receipt too. I'd had the idea for Volta for almost a year by then. a personal finance recovery app built for people who had made financial mistakes and didn't know where to start cleaning them up. Users photograph receipts, bank statements, bills. The app categorizes the damage, builds a personalized debt reduction roadmap, and adjusts the plan in real time as spending patterns change. Simple concept, technically complex, directly useful to the 43% of American adults who, according to a 2021 Federal Reserve report, couldn't cover a $400 emergency expense. I'd been sketching the architecture in notebooks for months. That afternoon in the parking garage, after being introduced as his sister in front of the stakeholder, I decided to stop sketching. I built Volta every morning from 5 to 7:30 before the Callaway workday started, every evening from 9 to midnight after it ended. I used a secondhand MacBook I'd bought for $620 on Craigslist and a whiteboard marker on the bathroom mirror of my apartment on East Cesar Chavez. By October of 2022, I had a working prototype. By January of 2023, I had a beta version I'd tested with 47 users recruited from a personal finance Reddit community. I submitted it to the App Store on February 28, 2023. First month, 41,000 downloads. Revenue, $19,400. I told my parents I was working on a personal project. Nothing too exciting yet. My mother said, "That was sweet, honey." My father asked if Dylan knew about it. Dylan, at the next team meeting, asked me to finalize a client deck by Thursday. I said sure. I finished the deck on Wednesday and spent Thursday morning reviewing Volta's Week 3 retention numbers. They had no idea I was already building the thing that would change all of it, and I wasn't ready for them to know, not yet. The November dinner was a Sunday. My mother had made enchiladas, which was her gesture of effort, the meal she made when she wanted the evening to feel warm and chosen rather than obligatory. The announcement came between the main course and dessert. Dylan stood up from his chair. He actually stood up like he was giving a toast, which told me the announcement had been practiced, and said that he and Anne had something to share. Anne extended her left hand. The ring was a round solitaire, cushion cut, probably 2 carats. My mother made a sound I can only describe as the sound of a woman whose narrative had just been confirmed. My father opened a bottle of wine he'd apparently been saving. My mother was already crying. Anne was laughing and covering her face with her hands, the performance of a woman who had rehearsed this moment carefully and was now executing it beautifully. I said congratulations. I meant it as much as I could. I poured myself a glass of wine. Then my father turned to me with the tone of someone who had just remembered that a secondary character existed and asked how things were going at work. I said they were going well, that I was developing something on my own, making some good progress. Dylan smiled, not cruelly. That was always the thing about Dylan. He never needed to be cruel. He had never once had to examine the difference between condescension and conversation, because nobody had ever required him to. He said that was great, that it was good I had side projects to keep me engaged, that sometimes in a corporate environment, the work could feel a little repetitive. He said it the way someone says good for you about a hobby they would never take seriously themselves. Anne agreed. She said she understood the feeling, that when she was earlier in her career, she'd felt the same way, that the key was to find a leadership path before the work started feeling stagnant. Then she looked at me with an expression that was technically sympathetic and said she was happy to pass along the name of her executive coach if I was feeling stuck. I was 31 years old with a 7-year performance record that outpaced everyone at that table. I had 112,000 active Volta users and $47,000 in monthly recurring revenue that I had built entirely alone on no funding before 7:30 in the morning while the rest of them were still asleep. I said thank you. That was really kind. My mother served dessert. My father refilled Anne's glass first. That was the moment I stopped being surprised and started counting down. In January of 2024, Stephen Brath called me into his office. Stephen was the CEO of Callaway Tech, 51 years old, a founder who had taken the company from 12 employees to 200 over 15 years, the kind of leader who actually walked the floor and knew people's names and projects. He told me that the Q3 client feedback had been exceptional, that my name had come up in 3 separate reviews, that he was considering restructuring the product development function, and that he saw a director-level role in that structure with my name on it. I thanked him. I did not mention Volta, which by that point had 890,000 downloads and $94,000 in monthly revenue, and a meeting scheduled for the following week with a venture capital firm whose portfolio I'd been studying for 8 months. I walked back to my desk. Anne's office was 14 feet from my cubicle. Glass-walled, always visible. She was on the phone when I walked past. She glanced at me the way she always did, just long enough to register my presence, not long enough to acknowledge it. I don't know exactly when she found out about the director conversation. My best guess is the same day, through the kind of administrative osmosis that happens in offices where the director of operations has relationships with every assistant on every floor. What I know is what happened next. I was terminated on a Thursday morning in February. 20 minutes notice, HR present, a manager I barely knew delivering the news from a script he was reading slightly too carefully. The stated reason was a vague phrase about team fit and organizational direction, 4 years of exceeding expectations, 7 years of service, a cardboard box. I walked out of the Callaway Tech building on 6th Street at 10:47 in the morning. I sat in my car in the parking garage and looked at my phone. There was a message from David Fisher asking to confirm our meeting the following Tuesday. There was a message from my mother asking if I was coming to Sunday dinner. There was nothing from Dylan. There was nothing from Anne. I replied to David. I told my mother I had a work conflict. Then I sat there for 38 minutes, not falling apart, not crying, just thinking. Thinking about what I knew, thinking about what I could prove, thinking about what I was going to do with both. That was the moment I understood the difference between being angry and being ready. I was done being angry. I was ready. I need to tell you about David Fisher because without him, this story has a different ending. Not a worse ending necessarily, but a lonelier one. David was 54 years old. He was the founder of Meridian Capital Partners, a venture fund based in Austin with a portfolio of 11 companies in the fintech and consumer tech sectors. He had a reputation in Austin's VC community for being the investor who actually read the product, not the pitch deck, the product. He'd been known to cancel second meetings with founders who couldn't explain their retention metrics. His analyst had found Volta in October of 2023, not through a pitch, not through a warm introduction, but because the analyst was 26 years old and using the app to pay off $11,000 in credit card debt from graduate school. He'd flagged it to David on a Monday morning. David had downloaded it, used it for 2 weeks, and then reached out directly through the App Store developer contact with a single sentence. "I'd like to meet the person who built this." We met at Cafe Medici on Congress Avenue on a Wednesday afternoon in October. He arrived before me, which I noted. He had a printed copy of my App Store analytics, obtained through a third-party data service, covered in handwritten margin notes in blue ink. He asked me within the first 4 minutes about my user retention rate at day 30. I told him, 61%. He nodded slowly, wrote something down, and said that was the best he'd seen in the personal finance category in 4 years. We talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes. He asked about the roadmap for the premium tier. He asked how I was planning to handle enterprise licensing if a financial institution came knocking. He asked what I would do with $6 million, and I told him, in specific terms with specific numbers, because I had a spreadsheet that answered that question, and I'd been refining it for 8 months, and I knew it cold. At the end of the meeting, he shook my hand and said he'd follow up by Friday. He followed up the next morning. The contract was signed on a Monday in March in his office on West 6th Street. The same week, Dylan stood up at a team stand-up and said the product roadmap for Q2 felt like more of the same, and glanced at Anne as he said it, the two of them sharing the small, reflexive cruelty of people who have never once had to question their own position. But what David gave me over the months that followed was something that went beyond the investment, and I want to be precise about what it actually was, because it would be easy to describe it as mentorship or friendship or professional support, and it was all of those things, but the core of it was simpler and rarer than any of those words. He asked questions about the work and then actually waited for the answers, not the polite pause of someone who has already formed their opinion and is waiting for you to finish speaking. Real waiting, the kind of silence that means I don't know yet what you're going to say and I'm interested in finding out. He called me on a Tuesday in December, a few months after the contract signed, to tell me he'd shown Volta's retention data to a colleague who ran a fintech accelerator in San Francisco, just to share it, not to broker a deal, not to expand his own position, just because he thought my work deserved to be seen by people who would understand what they were looking at. He said, "I know you don't need the validation, but I thought you should know someone else in the room agrees with me." I sat in my car in the Callaway Tech parking lot and read that text 3 times. I couldn't tell you exactly why it hit the way it did, except that I had spent so many years in rooms where my work was the invisible foundation of someone else's visible success. And here was a person who had no reason to amplify me, no family obligation, no professional debt, no social pressure, and was doing it anyway, because he thought it was right, because the work had earned it. That was the Tuesday I understood what it was supposed to feel like to be believed in. The conversation about Anne came 3 weeks after the contract signed. We were in the middle of a working lunch when he paused in the way I'd learned to recognize, the way David paused when he was deciding whether to say something difficult. He told me he needed to share something about someone I knew. He said he wanted to tell me directly because he thought I deserved to have accurate information about the people around me. He told me about Anne. He didn't tell me with relish. He told me the way a careful person tells an uncomfortable truth, precisely, without decoration, with the specific gentleness of someone who understands that the information will land hard, regardless of how it's delivered. He told me that between 2018 and 2020, before Anne joined Callaway Tech, she had worked through a private concierge agency that provided companionship for corporate events, and that the arrangement frequently extended beyond companionship. He told me he had been a client. He said he wasn't telling me to expose her. He was telling me because I was about to be connected, professionally and personally, to a situation he thought I should understand completely. I listened. I asked one question. Did he still have any messages from Stephen Braith about this? He looked at me. Why? I told him what had happened, the director conversation, the termination, the timing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his phone. He had a voice message from Stephen, sent the day after my termination. Stephen's tone was the relaxed, unguarded tone of a man messaging a longtime friend about something strange that had happened at the office, not the tone of a CEO being careful about a legal record. He described how Anne had come to his office the afternoon before. He described the offer, personal, specific, made by a director on his own team. He said the name, Anne Coldwell, my director of operations, clearly the way you say the name of someone you've known professionally for 2 years. He mentioned my name, said I was the developer whose promotion had prompted the visit. I asked David if I could have a copy of the message. He sent it to me that afternoon, along with a single text. I don't know what you're planning, but I'll be wherever you need me to be if you need a person in the room. For the first time in my adult life, I was sitting across from someone who had arrived at a conclusion about my worth entirely on his own, through the work, through the data, through 2 hours of real conversation at a coffee shop on Congress Avenue. Not through family loyalty, not through obligation, just here is what this is worth, and here is what I'm prepared to put behind it. That kind of belief doesn't feel like charity. It feels like oxygen. Once you breathe it, you don't go back. After I was let go from Callaway Tech, I went quiet. I stopped attending Sunday dinners. I responded to my mother's texts with, busy with the project, doing fine, and nothing more. I sent a congratulations card for the engagement, signed it with my name and nothing else. In the silence, I watched my family move forward without me. My father posted a photo of Dylan and Anne at a Texas Longhorns game in February with a caption that read, "The future of this family right here." Dylan posted on LinkedIn about leading his team through a Q1 product launch, 1,700 likes, and a comment from Anne that said, "The most brilliant person I know." My mother told her church friends that Ella was taking a little time to figure things out. At the March birthday dinner for my father, which I skipped, citing a work commitment that was real in every way that mattered, my mother texted me a photo of the table, Dylan and Anne on either side of Tony, everyone smiling, a chocolate cake in the center with the right number of candles. I looked at the photo for about 4 seconds, then I went back to reviewing the acquisition term sheet. What they didn't know, Meridian Capital Partners had formally completed its due diligence on Callaway Tech. The company's 2 largest enterprise clients had given notice in Q4. Their valuation had dropped to $4.1 million, a number I knew before Stephen Braith knew it, because David Fisher had sources and information he shared with me, because we were partners now, genuinely and contractually. The acquisition offer went to the board in late February. It was accepted in the first week of March. Dylan sent me an invitation to the engagement party on March 3rd, 67 guests, a private lakeside residence in Westlake Hills. He added that I'd make it, that it would mean a lot to have the whole family there. I responded the same day, I'll be there. I asked David if he would come. He said, just tell me when to arrive. They thought my silence meant I'd accepted my place. They had no idea it was the sound of a closing deal. I wore a black cocktail dress and low heels, the kind of outfit that is invisible until you're standing at a microphone, and then it's exactly right. My hair was down. I carried a small clutch with my phone inside and nothing else. The property in Westlake Hills was everything my mother had wanted it to be, a sprawling limestone and glass house with a terrace that stepped down to the water, string lights above the tables, the lake dark and flat beyond the railing. The catering was excellent. The flowers were extraordinary. Rose had spent 4 months planning this, and it showed in every detail. I arrived at 7:15. I hugged my mother. She said I looked beautiful. I said she did too, and I meant it. I shook my father's hand and found my place at the family table, near the front, which I had specifically hoped for when I RSVP'd. Anne crossed the room to greet me within minutes of my arrival, which told me something about how carefully she'd been watching the door. She said she was so glad I'd come, that it wouldn't have been the same without me. She said it with the specific warmth of someone who has nothing to worry about and wants you to know that they know it. I said I couldn't have missed it. Dylan embraced me, said he was really glad I was there. I think he meant it, in the way of someone who has never looked closely enough at the damage they've caused to understand it. He genuinely thought things were fine between us. I smiled. I had a glass of wine. I waited. Dinner moved the way these evenings move. Courses arriving, conversations overlapping, the comfortable energy of 67 people who are at ease in an expensive place. I watched the evening from a slight internal distance, the way you watch something when you already know the last scene. I talked to a cousin I hadn't seen since Christmas. I told my mother the enchiladas she'd packed for the welcome basket were wonderful, which was true. I watched Anne work the room with the ease of someone who has spent years making rooms feel like they belong to her. And I thought about what that skill costs and what it costs the people around you when you use it without care. At 9:15, the MC called everyone to attention for the formal program. Toasts from friends, a slideshow, and then a moment for Dylan to speak. He took the microphone. He was comfortable up there, in the way of someone who has been told his whole life that rooms like this belong to him. He thanked the host family. He thanked his parents. He looked at my father and said he was grateful every day for the example of what a strong man looked like. And my father touched his chest in the way fathers do when their sons say the thing they needed to hear. He looked at Anne and said something genuine and well-constructed about love. And I believed he loved her, in the way that people love the things that reflect back what they want to see. And then he looked at me. He said, and I've thought about it enough times that I know it word for word, that his sister Ella was here tonight, that she'd been on her own journey lately, figuring things out, that from one Watson to another, sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is let them find their own pace, even if it takes a little longer than expected. 67 people received that as a kind thing, the generous older brother, the patient family, the one being gracious about the one who hadn't quite kept up. I put my wine glass down. I stood up. The MC, who I had approached during cocktail hour with a quiet, specific request and a short explanation of what I was planning to share, nodded from the side of the stage and stepped back. Dylan watched me walk to the front of the room with polite surprise, the expression of a man who couldn't yet imagine a scenario where this didn't end up being about him. I took the microphone. The room settled into the attentive quiet of an audience expecting a toast. "Good evening," I said. "I promise I'll be brief." I connected my phone to the AV system, the same system that had just shown the photo slideshow, the same system the MC had walked me through 30 minutes earlier. I pulled up a document, the Meridian Capital Partners Acquisition Agreement for Callaway Tech, the signature page, the date. I projected it on the screen behind me. "Most of you know me as Dylan's sister," I said. "Some of you know me from Callaway Tech, where I worked for 7 years before being let go in February. What you probably don't know is that 18 months ago, I founded a company called Volta, a personal finance app with 2.1 million users and a $6 million investment contract signed last March. A pause that lasted exactly long enough. And what you definitely don't know is that 2 weeks ago, through Meridian Capital Partners, I completed the acquisition of Callaway Tech. I'm the new owner, effective this week." The room was very still. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father looked at the screen, then at me, then at the screen again, the way someone looks when the math isn't resolving. Dylan had gone the color of the white tablecloths. Anne had gone something different, something more careful, because Anne knew there was more coming. She didn't know what exactly, but she knew enough to know that if I was standing at a microphone at her engagement party with a projection screen behind me, whatever came next was about her. She was right. Before I sit down, I said there's one more thing I want to share because I believe in transparency and because I think the people in this room deserve to have accurate information about the people they're celebrating tonight. I played the audio. Stephen Braith's voice filled the room through the same speakers that had just been playing Dylan and Anne's favorite songs. His voice was relaxed, friendly, the completely unguarded voice of a man talking to an old friend about something strange that had happened at the office. He described the visit. He described the offer, a personal offer, specific in nature, made by a director on his own team. He mentioned the name, Ann Caldwell, my director of operations, clearly the way you say the name of someone you've known professionally for 2 years. He mentioned that he'd looked her up afterward, figured out that David knew her from another context, back when she worked through that agency. He said my name, said I was the developer whose promotion had prompted the visit. The audio ended. Nobody spoke. Anne was completely still, not frozen, controlled. The controlled stillness of someone applying every resource they have to not coming apart in a room full of people she's known for years. Dylan turned to look at her. I watched his face go through 4 or 5 things in about 8 seconds. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked less like anger than grief. He had loved her. That was real. And the specific pain of finding out that someone you love has been performing a version of themselves for you is its own category of damage, the kind that doesn't have a clean name. Then my father stood up. His voice came out in the measured, authoritative register he'd spent 30 years perfecting, the voice that had talked juries into things. He said this was inappropriate, that audio could be manipulated, that I had no right to turn a family celebration into something like this. David, I said, would you mind? David Fisher had come in through the terrace doors at 9 o'clock. He'd been standing near the back for 15 minutes, patient and still, in a gray blazer, the kind of man who was completely comfortable waiting because he is completely comfortable everywhere. He raised his hand from where he stood. He said his name. He said he was the managing partner at Meridian Capital Partners, and that the voice on the recording belonged to Stephen Braith, CEO of Callaway Tech, a man he'd known for 11 years. He said the audio was authentic and unedited, and that he was available to answer any questions about its context or content. He said it with the measured composure of a man giving testimony, clear, specific, with no trace of drama in his voice, which made it 10 times more devastating than drama would have been. Dylan sat down onto his chair very slowly. Not a collapse, just the gradual, honest movement of a man whose legs have quietly stopped doing their job. Anne said his name. He didn't respond. I put the microphone back in the stand. I picked up my clutch. Congratulations on the engagement, I said. I walked off the stage, down the 3 small steps and across the terrace toward the doors. The 67 people in that room let me pass in complete silence. The silence of people who are updating everything they thought they knew and don't yet have words for what they're replacing it with. At the terrace door, I stopped for one moment. I looked back at the table where my family was sitting, my mother, her hand still at her mouth. My father, standing, not sitting, looking across the room at me with the expression of a man who was revising a document he thought was finished years ago. I held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then I walked out. The engagement was canceled the following morning. Anne sent Dylan a message at 11:47 a.m. and had blocked his number by noon. I know this because my mother called me and told me through tears, and then immediately asked if I was okay, which was the first time she had ever asked me that question in a way that suggested she actually needed the answer. In the weeks following the party, I received 9 calls from my mother, 4 emails from my father, and 1 message from Dylan. Dylan's message was 2 sentences, that he'd been thinking about what he said on that stage, about finding your own pace, that he hadn't realized what he was doing. I read it twice. I didn't respond for 6 days. When I did, I said, I know you didn't. That was always the problem. He read it immediately and didn't reply, and I understood that as the beginning of something. Not resolution, but honest accounting, which is the only place resolution can actually start. My father called on a Tuesday evening, 12 days after the party. He sounded like a man who had spent 12 days preparing a conversation and had arrived at the conclusion that no version of it would be adequate. He said he was proud of me. He said it without qualifiers, without pivoting, without the practiced instinct to shape the narrative into something more comfortable. Just, Ella, I am proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago. I told him I heard him. He went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I see you, Ella. I see you now. It doesn't fix 32 years. You don't fix 32 years on a phone call. But I believe he meant it, and meaning it is the only place the work of changing can start. That was enough. For now, it was enough. I was formally named CEO of Callaway Tech on March 31st. My first week, I rehired 2 engineers who had been laid off in a cost-cutting move before the acquisition, people I'd worked alongside for years, people who had watched the company change around them without the language to describe what they were losing. My second week, I restructured the management tier, eliminating 3 redundant director-level positions. Anne's role was among them, terminated with cause, with full HR documentation, with the particular quiet efficiency of someone who has been doing that math for a long time. Dylan left Callaway 2 weeks after the party. He resigned by email on a Monday morning and took a position managing operations at one of my father's dealerships in Round Rock, which I think was both a humiliation and a relief in the way that going home sometimes is when everywhere else has collapsed. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I felt something closer to tired and clear. Volta reached 2.1 million users in Q1. Callaway Tech's 2 departing enterprise clients were in re-engagement conversations by May, one renewed at an expanded annual contract value of $280,000. David joined the Meridian board formally in April. And at the kitchen table in my apartment on East Cesar Chavez, the same table where I built Volta at 5 in the morning for 18 months, the same table where I reviewed acquisition documents while my family posted photos celebrating the future of the Watsons without noticing I was already building it, I sat one evening in April and understood something I want to leave you with. I hadn't done it all to prove them wrong. That would be a simpler story and in some ways a more satisfying one. But proving people wrong is a destination, and I was never trying to arrive somewhere. I was trying to build something. For 32 years, I was introduced as a function of other people's stories. Dylan's sister, the one still figuring it out, the one who had the side projects. I spent so long trying to understand what was wrong with me that I almost missed the fact that the question itself was wrong. There was nothing wrong with me. There was just a family that needed me small, and a woman who had decided the easiest way to stay ahead was to make sure nobody climbed past her, and a father who had watched from a comfortable distance for 3 decades and called it love. They needed me small to feel large, and I spent a long time trying to understand what was wrong with me that I couldn't seem to stay small. There was nothing wrong with me. I just needed room. Build quietly. Grow in the dark, and when you're ready, and you'll know when you're ready, step into the light. They'll see you then, but by that point, you'll already have seen yourself, and that's the part that actually matters. If this story hit somewhere real, if you've been the one your family brought to events as proof that the other one was doing better, I want to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done with that microphone? And if you're not subscribed yet, hit the button. I've got more stories coming about what it really means to build something on your own terms. Thank you for being here. Thank you for seeing me.